Liza Zervalakos. I have a master's in forensic psychology, and I'm currently in the process of finishing my doctorate degree in forensic psychology. I'm also the founder and president of Trauma Speaks, a mental health nonprofit organization that's based in Los Angeles. And our mission is to raise awareness about mental health, especially among school aged youth and young adults in college, and also highlight the importance that mental health is just as important as physical health because mental health is not black and white. It's not a one size fits all. And today I will be briefly talking about gender based violence, also known as GBV. So, before we get started, what is gender based violence? Gender based violence is violence that's directed at an individual based on their biological sex or gender identity. It includes physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and or psychological abuse. It also includes threats, coercion, and economic or educational deprivation. And these may occur either in public or in an individual's private life. And what factors contribute to women or individuals in general to stay in an abusive relationship? So there are several factors that may reinforce the idea of um, staying in an unhealthy relationship. But first and foremost, victims of abuse are isolated from their loved ones. And through this isolation, it becomes easier for the perpetrator to control their victim. So if you're isolated, it makes it difficult for you to leave the situation or the relationship because you have no one else to turn to other than your abuser. Why? Because your abuser has created an environment where you're dependent on them. And you can see these especially with individuals who are financially dependent or um, they are dependent on an individual for housing. And it is important to note that these factors that I'll be going over are not only just applicable to women, but to any gender or sexual orientation. And so, with isolation, this also leads us to the next factor, preventing anyone from leaving an abusive relationship, which is fear. Not only fear from being unable to make it on your own, but also fear from your abuser who have been inflicting harm. And those threats, whether verbal or physical, can heavily impact someone's mental health, especially if it includes any type of physical abuse or any physical abuse. Um, it's normal to feel fear because you don't know what this person is capable of doing. And this might even be more prevalent in situations where children are involved because this also adds onto the fear of the victim that the victim is already feeling because it's not just about them anymore. They have to be concerned of someone else's safety, which could be the kids. It goes beyond them. And also, another factor is believing that the abuser will change and that this only happens during certain situations where the victim would place the fault onto themselves or blame themselves. And this will make more sense once we talk about the domestic violence cycle or the power and control wheel, which we'll get to it later. But abusers don't change their behavior without professional help. And even with professional help, this may this might take a while because they don't realize that what they're doing is wrong, or maybe they do know it's wrong, in which case they won't um, they won't change unless they believe that the behavior needs to change. And also, it's important. Um, I want to highlight this message that it's not the victim's fault. But because their abusers are manipulative and controlling, they're able to twist it around and put it on the victim. And so now the victim is blaming themselves. They truly believe that it's their fault. And these factors, like I said earlier, will help understand the cycle, and why individuals remain in an abusive relationship. So, with all of these, it creates some type of distorted thinking in the victim's mind. They would start to believe that this person is the only one that can love them. This person loves them despite of their flaws, and that no one would be able to love them because they have internalized all these negative messages that they received from their abuser, the negative messages that they have been fed with. Like, for example, it was your fault that I did this. No one else is going to love you because you're clumsy, you're stupid, you don't know how to do this, or, you talk back, or whatever it is that they would use to control the victim. But please know that it's not your fault, and you're not to blame for their behavior. Their behavior is their responsibility, not yours. Another thing that sometimes we overlook is family history. And what do I mean by this? So, for example, does the victim or even the perpetrator have a history of witnessing domestic violence at home? Maybe this was normalized while they were growing up and they don't see it as an abusive and unhealthy relationship because, you know, they're your parents are your role models. They're your first role models. And so if you see that happening at home, you will probably think that this is normal. And when you see it in your relationship, you don't think that it's not okay because, I mean, you saw it as a child and no one said it was bad. And, this particular factor will become helpful and useful, especially in treatment, in therapy, when working with uh, um, victims or perpetrators of any type of abuse. Speaking of treatment or therapy, um, treatment methods that could be effective in helping clients that are dealing with gender-based violence. um, there's several things that you can utilize or that is found to be effective. First one is, of course, therapy, trauma focused therapy. And this is effective because gender based violence, it's a form of trauma. And so um, it's important to utilize trauma focused interventions to address the trauma that is experienced by the victim or even the abuser in order to heal and move forward. Um, and also, part of this process, it would be important to do cognitive behavioral therapy or interventions or techniques, because as I mentioned earlier, there are distorted thinking. So cognitive distortions are prevalent um, while they were or are still in the relationship. All those messages they've received, it might be possible that it's not just within the relationship. Maybe they have heard that as a child as well, and that's something that you know that needs to be addressed. And for them to get back that control that they lost, for them to feel empowered, it's important for those two things, the trauma to be addressed and also their cognitive distortions to be reframed or challenged, because um, the ultimate goal of um, treatment for victims of abuse or domestic violence is taking back their control, empowering them. because they lost that while they were in that abusive relationship, because they were controlled, they were manipulated, they felt helpless, they felt hopeless. So it's all about helping them get back on their feet, trust themselves, trust their decisions, um, and be confident about themselves, and just feel that power and control again, that they have over their lives, instead of feeling um, dependent on someone else. Also, another helpful treatment is, psychoeducation, providing information on healthy relationships, teaching them how to build healthy relationships, or what to look for in a healthy relationship. And this is most beneficial if they have a family history of domestic violence. And another thing that can be helpful is, seeking community-based programs, any prevention and intervention program that the community has specifically for abusive or domestic violence cases, bystander intervention, um, teaching others, like family members or friends, um, to learn how to notice signs and symptoms, and just creating more awareness about domestic violence or intimate partner violence or gender-based violence. Um, because the more people are aware, the more that they'll see see or notice the signs, and possibly intervene and help that person before it gets worse. And also just learning how to help, and even creating awareness of resources available, such as shelters. Um, so it's a holistic approach. There's an effective treatment for the individual, and there's also something that the community can do for these individuals as well. Um, and in terms of um, parents who are exposing their children to violence, children can hear and see everything as much as we think they don't. Um, and parents are their role models. So what they see is what they think is what's normal. Monkey see, monkey do. So if you argue a lot, your kids would think that that is what a healthy relationship looks like, or that that's normal. If there's physical abuse, they will think that it's okay to be hit when you're in a relationship. And they ultimately learn love at a young age through their parents. So if what they learn is unhealthy love, it will most likely lead to the children either being a perpetrator of abuse or victim of abuse. So now, going into the cycle of abuse, um, there's three phases. The first one is the honeymoon phase, and we all know this. When you just get into a relationship, there's that honeymoon phase where you're just all over each other. You can't stop, not spending time together. This is where typically a lot of people see, the positive things, the good things about a person. But then after the honeymoon phase, there's the tension that builds. Um, and this is where usually the arguments starts happening. Um, and then there's the explosion stage, where that's the attack occurring, the threats, the abuse that's happening. So with the cycle of abuse, the honeymoon phase is where the apologies are, the promises. I'm never going to do this again. I'm so sorry. Um, Blaming the victim. It's your fault that I lost my temper because you couldn't make things right. And also the gifts. So it could be like bringing you home flowers, or taking you out to dinner, or, just a token that says that they're apologetic for the explosion phase that I mentioned earlier. The tension building is where, it's starting to escalate. So there's shouting, there's a criticism, you can't do things right, like, you've done this over and over again, you just, you, you don't know how to do anything, or like the swearing, um, also coercion. There's a lot of anger in this tension build phase. Um, because of that anger results to the explosion where the abuse begins. Um, and then it goes back all the way again to the honeymoon phase. And in terms of the power and control wheel, there's different aspects involved in it. So there's physical violence or sexual violence. Um, they can use intimidation, so making someone afraid by using looks, if they look at you in a certain way, actions or gestures, destroying someone's property, um, or intimidation by displaying weapon. Like if they have a gun, maybe they'll leave the gun on the table just to intimidate you or instill that fear. Smashing things, or abusing pets. There's also, like I said earlier, emotional abuse. So it could be name calling, stupid, dumb, um, and playing mind games, making you feel like you're crazy, like you're just making it up all in your head that never happened, even though it actually did. This can also be called as gaslighting. It could also be emotional abuse, can also include humiliating someone, putting someone down, making someone feel guilty all the time for whatever happened. And like I said earlier, making someone think that they are crazy. Um, but it's just that manipulation. They're trying to control and manipulate you. Um, there's also using isolation, which was one of the factors I talked about earlier. So they can use jealousy to justify the actions. Like, I don't want you hanging out with that person, especially if it's the opposite sex, or if it's a sexual orientation or gender issue. Whichever it is that the abuser is jealous of, that's what they're going to justify their actions. Like, I don't trust them around you, or like this, you've been spending a lot of time with your best friend or whatsoever, you're not spending that much time with me. So it's a way to manipulate and control you, to isolate you. And then isolation is just limiting your involvement with the outside world. So sometimes it could be like you need to ask for permission to go somewhere, um, controlling everything that you do, who you talk to, what you read, even where you go. And then there's also denying, minimizing, and blaming. So blaming is a huge part of the abusive relationship. So this can, denying, minimizing, and blaming could um, present itself through, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for the behavior to the victim rather than the abuser, um, not taking the victim's concerns seriously, or making fun of them or making light of them, that it wasn't that bad, like I didn't hit you that hard. Um, and so it's making light of the abuse. And then also there's using children, which I mentioned earlier, that increases the fear that's instilled in them if they have to think about someone else's safety other than theirs. So children would be a huge part of that power and control factor. Um, the abuser could make the victim feel guilty about the children, or using the children to deliver or relay messages, or threatening to take the child away or make you look bad so you won't ever see your children again. um, There's also the use of privilege as a factor, and power and control. So, if they make all the big decisions, um, like for example, if they're financially dependent or their housing situation depends on that person, that could be a type of privilege, using privilege and treating someone like a servant. So instead of treating them like your partner, you treat them like a servant because you hold all of that power. And this defines the roles of each person in the relationship. And then there's also the use of economic abuse, which is preventing someone from working, which of course will help, will affect their financial situation. So you're in this case, you're literally creating the environment for them to be dependent on you, which goes back to what I talked about earlier. Or it could be taking someone's money, or savings, controlling their money, or giving someone an allowance. And this goes back into like you're treating them not like a partner. And then the last one is using coercion or threats. So making or even following through that threat to hurt someone, um, threatening to leave or um, committing suicide or um, reporting them, um, or like threatening to out a partner. So those are examples of using coercion and threats. You're trying to find a way to um, kind of like guilt trip that person into not leaving you. And um, lastly, in terms of, any message to perpetrators and victims, I would like to first give this important message to victims of abuse. Your situation may be difficult and it may seem really hopeless, and you may feel helpless, like being in your situation is your only option. But please know that there are resources available, there is support for you, and that you're not alone in this situation. Um, it's also important for victims of abuse to know that you can and you will get through this. It's not easy, and the future may be difficult and scary because of the unknown, especially if you've been isolated and there's that fear, and you're dependent on that person. But there is support. There are a lot of resources to help you, to help individuals in this type of situation. Um, and lastly, it's not your fault. Please know that it's not your fault. And to perpetrators of abuse, you can also get help. There are resources available that can help you as well in changing or addressing your behavior. There are organizations out there who specifically provide help to perpetrators, like respectphoneline.org. However, they are based in UK, but their website is very informative. And they also provide a list of resources on there. And there's also organizations that do provide help for both perpetrators and victims. But the important part of this message is that your behavior is your responsibility, not the victims. There are things in our life that we can control and we cannot control. What is within our control is how we react and respond to things in life. What is out of our control is what others do. And there are other ways to communicate your thoughts and feelings without hurting someone else, without threatening someone else. Violence and control does not make anyone, especially within your family unit, safe. So, thank you for listening to me provide information, or educating you on gender-based violence. I hope that you found this useful and helpful.